This is the brief on money laundering in Philippine casino junkets. While these all-inclusive gaming tours for wealthy VIPs bring massive revenue into the Philippines, they've kind of become a VIP washing machine. Imagine millions in stolen digital funds suddenly being converted into untraceable physical casino chips. First, let's look at the Bangladesh bank heist blueprint. Back in 2016, hackers actually stole $81 million, funneling it through RCBC bank accounts and a remittance company called Philrem, straight into Solaire Casino. A junket group then bought non-negotiable chips, effectively cleaning that stolen cash. This massive heist exposed the exact mechanics of how junkets hide dirty money, but, was it just an isolated event? Second, the alarming scale of the problem today says no. The Anti-Money Laundering Council's January 2023 report showed that between 2020 and 2022, 4 high-risk resorts filed 4,110 suspicious transaction reports valued at nearly 17.6 billion pesos. The biggest red flag? Safekeeping of playing chips with the casino treasury. That is billions of pesos. With numbers that high, you have to ask yourself, are we dealing with a few bad actors, or is the system itself fundamentally broken? Finally, the legal crackdown. Authorities are fighting back with strict reporting guidelines for non-financial businesses and powerful legal tools like the Supreme Court's Lingad precedent. This landmark ruling proves you can be convicted of money laundering just for knowing you're transacting with dirty money, even if the prosecution doesn't prove who committed the original underlying crime. This makes it way easier to prosecute the middlemen facilitating these transactions. While landmark rulings and stricter reporting are tightening the net, the massive flow of physical cash in casino junkets remains a high-stakes gamble for regulators.
Forget guns and getaway cars. I want you to imagine a bank heist so high-tech it happens with just keyboards and code. A crime that hits a country's central bank and then uses the entire global financial system as its escape route. We're going to dive into one of the biggest digital heists ever and see how it blew a massive hole in one country's fight against dirty money. $81 million. That is the insane amount of money that was stolen from the Central Bank of Bangladesh in this incredible cyber attack. But, stealing the money, that was actually the easy part. The real trick was figuring out how to make it all disappear. So, here's our game plan for this explainer. We are going to follow the money. We'll start with the heist itself, then we'll pull back the curtain on the playbook criminals used to make dirty money look clean. We're going to see how the law tried to fight back, where it failed spectacularly, how they fixed the system, and finally, why this high-stakes game of cat and mouse really matters to all of us. All right, so how in the world did this actually happen? Well, it was a crime that was all about precision, expert timing, and frankly, a little bit of good luck for the bad guys. It all kicked off on February 4th, 2016. Hackers used stolen credentials to blast the New York Fed with 35 fake transfer requests from Bangladesh's account. Now, most got blocked, but 5 slipped through. And just like that, $81 million was zapped to 4 brand new, totally fake bank accounts in the Philippines. And the timing here, it was absolutely brilliant. The transfers hit on a Friday. By the time Monday rolled around, it was Chinese New Year, a huge public holiday in the Philippines. That delay was the exact window the criminals needed. By Tuesday, when the bank finally could act, it was too late. The money was already gone. So picture this money trail. It's fast and it's complicated. It goes from the New York Fed, lands in those 4 fake accounts in Manila, then it's quickly bundled together, shot through a remittance company, and then funneled into the one place where it could basically vanish into thin air, the Philippine casino industry. You see, stealing the money is one challenge, but actually being able to spend it, that's a whole different problem. And to do that, criminals have to wash it. They have to make it look totally legitimate. And that, my friends, is the dark art of money laundering. So let's ask the big question here. From the criminal's point of view, how do you take $81 million in stolen digital funds and magically turn it into clean, spendable, and most importantly, untraceable cash? Now, the law has a pretty formal definition for this. Money laundering is just the process of taking cash from a crime, in this case a massive hack, and running it through a bunch of transactions to hide where it really came from. It's literally about making dirty money look squeaky clean. And this whole process usually happens in 3 classic stages. First up is placement. That's just getting the dirty money into the system. For our hackers, that was depositing the $81 million into those fake bank accounts. Step 2 is layering. This is where you create a messy, confusing trail of transactions to throw people off the scent. Think about the quick consolidation and the transfers through the remittance company. And finally, you have integration. The money slips back into the regular economy looking totally legit. And in our story, that happened the moment it was swapped for casino chips. It was officially clean. Now, of course, there are entire systems designed to stop exactly this from happening. So let's take a look at how the country's financial defenders tried to step in and shut this down. The main hero in this part of the story is the Anti-Money Laundering Council, or the AMLC. This is the government's financial intelligence unit, and their whole job is to sniff out, investigate, and put a stop to money laundering. And one of the biggest weapons in the AMLC's arsenal is something called a freeze order. If they have good reason to believe that some money is tied to a crime, they can go to a court and get an order to freeze those assets instantly. It's designed to stop criminals right in their tracks. And that's exactly what they did here. The AMLC managed to trace a huge slice of the money, over 1.3 billion pesos, to a bank account that belonged to a major casino. They went to court, got the freeze order, and locked it down. For a second there, it looked like the system was working perfectly. Or so it seemed. But this is where the story gets wild, because the criminals had an ace up their sleeve. They had found and exploited a massive casino-sized loophole in the very law that was supposed to catch them. See, the whole anti-money laundering law depends on this idea of a covered person. These are specific businesses, like banks, that are legally required to report any large or sketchy-looking transactions to the AMLC. They're basically the tripwires for the whole financial system. And this, right here, is the smoking gun. Back in 2016, look at who had to report. Banks, yep. Insurance companies, of course. Even remittance companies. But casinos? Nope. They were not considered covered persons. They had zero legal duty to report anything suspicious. The money had flowed straight into a regulatory black hole. And this wasn't some minor oversight. It was the casino's entire legal defense. They stood up in court and basically argued, hey, we weren't a covered institution back then, so the law doesn't apply to us. And guess what? It worked. The freeze order on their money was eventually lifted. The launderers had found the perfect legal exit ramp. Well, a heist this huge, this embarrassing, simply couldn't be ignored. The massive loophole that it exposed forced an immediate and very necessary change in the law. Legislators scrambled to patch this hole, and they did it by amending the Anti-Money Laundering Act. They expanded the definition of covered persons. And guess what was at the very top of the new list? You got it, casinos. But they also added other potential weak spots, like jewelers and even certain legal and accounting services. And this change was a big deal. It means that today, casinos have to play by the exact same rules as banks. They have to know who their customers are, they have to assess the risks, and crucially, they have to report any suspicious activity to the AMLC. The loophole was officially slammed shut. Okay, so new laws were written, rules were tightened up. But what does that actually mean in the real world? Can these new, tougher laws actually lead to justice? I mean, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it? It's one thing to have a strong law written down, but it's a completely different thing to actually use it to put someone behind bars. And the answer, as it turns out, is a huge yes. A landmark Supreme Court ruling in 2023, in a separate case, proved it. The court convicted a former banker and set this incredibly important precedent. You don't have to be the one who stole the money to be a money launderer. If you handle the money knowing it's dirty, you're guilty. That sent a shockwave through the financial industry. It was a clear message. The system now works, and this law has real teeth. The $81 million heist was an absolute wake-up call. It forced the law to evolve. But it leaves us with one final and pretty urgent question. The bad guys are always getting smarter, always innovating. The next big heist is going to look totally different from this one. The real question is, how will our laws and our defenses keep up with a threat we can't even see yet?
Imagine it is a quiet Friday night, a holiday weekend.
Right. Nobody is really paying attention.
Exactly. You are sitting in an office halfway across the world, just typing a few lines of code into a computer terminal. And with just a few keystrokes, $81 million vanishes from the most secure bank vault on Earth.
Federal Reserve Bank of New York.
Yeah, the New York Fed, it has just gone digital air. But here's the truly mind-bending part of this whole thing. 3 days later, that exact same digital money has magically transformed into physical plastic chips sitting on a baccarat table in Manila.
Surrounded by people getting complimentary drinks.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds like a Hollywood screenwriter's fever dream.
It really does.
But the reality is actually far more methodical, and honestly, it's far more terrifying because of how seamlessly it exploits the actual, the architecture of global finance. Money laundering at this level is not about guys in trench coats handing over duffel bags of cash in a dark alley.
Right, it's not a mob movie. No, it is an administrative art form. It's the exploitation of complex legal timelines, structural blind spots, and bureaucratic friction.
Welcome to this deep dive. Today, we are taking you on a journey through the high-stakes cat-and-mouse game of global money laundering. Our mission is to decode exactly how financial criminals attempt to make millions and sometimes billions of dollars vanish in plain sight.
And just as importantly, we are going to look at how the legal system scrambles, sometimes years after the fact, to patch the massive loopholes that these syndicates exploit.
Because it is a perpetual arms race.
Oh, absolutely. The authorities build a reinforced wall, and the criminals immediately invent a ladder. Then the regulators build a taller wall, and the criminals just tunnel underneath it. We are going to track that exact evolution step by step over the course of 2 decades of Philippine legal history.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because we're building up to that unbelievable climax today, the infamous 2016 Bangladesh bank heist, where hackers turned the New York Fed upside down. But before we can rob a central bank or, wash $81 million through a casino VIP room, we need to understand the bedrock.
We have to know the rules of the game.
Right. We need to look at how the law actually defines the physical and legal act of washing dirty money.
You really cannot understand the genius of the heist without first understanding the rules of the game at the time it occurred. So we have to rewind to the foundational legal framework in the Philippines, which was established in 2001.
The Anti-Money Laundering Act, right?
Yes, Republic Act 9160, widely known as the AMLA.
And when this law first rolled out in 2001, it was essentially the government's first major attempt to put a net over the financial system. But looking at the parameters they set, that net had some incredibly wide holes.
Oh, massive holes.
The threshold for what constituted a transaction that the government actually needed to know about was shockingly high.
By modern standards, it was a massive runway for illicit funds. Under that original 2001 legislation, a covered transaction, meaning a transaction that a bank was legally obligated to report to the government, was defined as a single transaction or a series of transactions involving a total amount in excess of 4 million Philippine pesos.
4 million pesos.
Right, occurring within 5 consecutive banking days.
Just to give you a sense of scale, depending on historical exchange rates, that is hovering somewhere around 80 to 100,000 US dollars. And you had a 5-day window to move it.
Exactly.
So wait, if I'm a criminal in 2001, I could walk into a bank and deposit 3.9 million pesos in cash on a Monday, and the bank doesn't have to tell anyone.
Legally, no. As long as you did not cross that 4 million peso threshold within that specific 5-day window, you flew completely under the radar.
That is wild.
It was. And the institutions that were covered by this law back then were primarily traditional financial pillars. We were talking commercial banks, insurance companies, corporate entities regulated by the Securities and Exchange Commission.
So to police this new reporting system, the law also created a specialized watchdog, right? The Anti-Money Laundering Council, or the AMLC.
Yeah, the AMLC was designed as a powerful, concentrated triad of financial authority. It's chaired by the governor of the Bangko Sentral King Pilipinas, the central bank, and includes the commissioner of the Insurance Commission and the chairman of the Securities and Exchange Commission.
A pretty heavy-hitting group.
Very. Their mandate is to act unanimously to investigate suspicious transactions, institute civil forfeiture proceedings to seize dirty assets, and implement freeze orders.
But laws on paper are very different from laws in practice. To truly understand how this framework operates when it hits the real world, we need to look at a landmark Supreme Court case that was finally resolved quite recently, actually, in October 2022.
The Lingad precedent.
Yes, the Lingad precedent. And what I find so compelling about this story is that it has nothing to do with international cyber hackers or heavily armed drug cartels.
No, the threat in this case came from inside the house.
Exactly. This is the story of girlie Lingad. She was a banker. She worked inside the system. And rather than breaking down the front door, she used her specific privileged employee access to the bank's internal computer network.
To conduct anomalous, completely unauthorized fund transactions involving client accounts.
She weaponized her institutional knowledge.
That is exactly what she did. A bank teller or branch manager understands the internal auditing rhythms. They know when the system reconciles. They know what kind of overrides trigger an alarm and what kind of transfers blend in with daily commercial traffic.
Because they look at it every day.
Right. Lingad understood the architecture of the very system designed to protect the money, which made her incredibly effective at subverting it.
She was siphoning funds, but the bank eventually caught on to the discrepancies. In 2004, sensing the walls closing in, she goes AWOL. Absent without official leave.
She just vanished.
Yeah. The internal auditors start digging deep into her specific terminal activity, and they unravel the string of unauthorized transfers. But by the time they compile the evidence, she is gone. She has already fled the country and relocated to the United States.
Which initiates a massive jurisdictional headache. But it also demonstrates the long reach of international financial law. A criminal charge is officially filed against her in 2006. And it takes time, but the Philippine government actually manages to navigate the extradition treaty with the U.S., locate her, and pull her back to Manila to face trial.
Upon her arraignment, she pleads not guilty, and we enter a grueling legal marathon. In August 2013, the trial court looks at the digital footprints she left on the bank's servers, finds overwhelming evidence that she processed these anomalous transactions, and convicts her of money laundering under Section 4 of the AMLA.
And of course, she appeals.
She does. She appeals that decision to the Court of Appeals. They review it, and they affirm the conviction. Not willing to give up, she escalates it all the way to the highest court in the land. Finally, in 2022, the Supreme Court definitively affirms her conviction, closing the book on the case.
That is an 18-year legal saga, from the moment she abandoned her post to the final Supreme Court decision.
18 years.
Yeah. But the duration of the trial, while exhausting, is not the actual legacy of this case. The true impact lies in how the Supreme Court used this specific ruling to draw an indelible structural line between two fundamentally different legal concepts.
Which are?
The predicate crime and the actual offense of money laundering.
Let's pause here because this distinction is the absolute core of how authorities prosecute financial crime. Break down the difference between the predicate crime and the wash.
Well, in the mechanics of money laundering, there is almost always a predicate offense. This is the underlying unlawful activity. It's the crime that actually generates the dirty money in the first place.
Like selling drugs or something.
Yeah. Exactly. Kidnapping for ransom, selling illegal narcotics, or in Lingad's case, the unauthorized taking of funds from bank clients, which is essentially qualified theft. The theft generates the capital. Money laundering is the subsequent separate act of transacting that stolen money to make it appear as though it came from a legitimate source.
So the theft is the dirt and the laundering is the washing machine.
Precisely. And what the Supreme Court definitively ruled in the Lingad case is a game changer for prosecutors. They ruled that you do not need a prior conviction for the predicate crime in order to be convicted of money laundering.
Wait, let me make sure I'm grasping the gravity of that. You are saying the government does not have to prove you are guilty of the initial bank robbery before they throw you in prison for washing the cash from the robbery.
That is exactly the precedent. The criminal action for the unlawful activity, the theft, can proceed completely independently of the money laundering charge. The prosecution does not have to prove who committed the predicate crime, nor do they have to secure a conviction for it first. The money laundering charge stands on its own. To secure a conviction for money laundering, the state only has to prove two specific elements. First, that the money or property in question represents the proceeds of an unlawful activity, and second, that the person transacting that money knew it came from an unlawful activity.
I need to test the boundaries of this knowing concept. Let's run a hypothetical.
Sure, go ahead.
Let's say I'm selling my used car. A guy answers my ad, comes over, looks at the car, and pays me $50,000 in cash. Unbeknownst to me, this guy is a prolific bank robber, and the $50,000 he just handed me was stolen from a vault 3 hours ago. I take the cash and deposit it into my bank account. Am I suddenly a money launderer? Because I just transacted with the proceeds of a major crime.
That is the perfect stress test for Section 4 of the AMLA, and it highlights why the law was written the way it was. The absolute fulcrum of the statute is the word knowing. The law explicitly states that money laundering is committed by any person who, knowing that any monetary instrument or property represents, involves, or relates to the proceeds of any unlawful activity, transacts it.
So my ignorance is my defense.
Your genuine good faith ignorance, yes. If you sell the used car at fair market value through a standard transaction with absolutely zero knowledge of the buyer's illicit career, you lack the requisite criminal intent. You did not know. Therefore, you are not laundering.
But let's flip the scenario. What if the guy shows up to buy my car, throws a duffel bag on my driveway and says, look, I just hit a bank downtown. The cops are everywhere. I need to get rid of this cash immediately. I will give you $100,000 in small unmarked bills for your $50,000 car right now, no paperwork. And I look at the bag, I look at the car, and I say, deal.
In that moment, the legal dynamic shifts entirely. You now know the funds represent the proceeds of an unlawful activity. He explicitly told you.
Right.
By agreeing to the transaction, you are actively facilitating the conversion of stolen cash into a physical asset. The car. You are providing the washing machine. You are now committing the crime of money laundering.
That makes complete sense. The knowledge is the legal contagion. The moment you are aware the money is dirty, the act of touching it, moving it, or exchanging it makes you guilty of laundering. And Lingad obviously possessed that knowledge because she was the architect of the theft.
Exactly. She manipulated the computer system to steal the money, so she inherently knew the funds she was transferring later were illicit. And the Supreme Court noted that establishing the separation is a massive structural victory for law enforcement. Well, before this precedent was firmly cemented, sophisticated criminal syndicates would use endless legal appeals to stall their predicate crime convictions. If the laundering charge required a theft conviction first, the criminals could tie the theft case up in appellate courts for a decade, meaning the government could never touch the washed assets or prosecute the launderers.
Oh, I see.
The Lingad precedent cuts that knot. It ensures the AMLC can aggressively pursue the washed assets and the washers completely independently of the underlying crime.
But while the Lingad case was a victory, it also exposed a massive vulnerability in the government's initial approach. Lingad used the traditional commercial banking system, and as the law caught rogue bankers like her, and as the AMLC started freezing accounts under that original 2001 framework, the criminal syndicates paying attention realized that the traditional banking system was getting too hot.
They realized the authorities were watching the front door.
Yes. And criminals are nothing if not pragmatic, market-driven actors. If you block the front door, they will immediately test the windows.
And the government quickly realized that their original threshold, 4 million pesos over 5 days, was not just a window. It was a set of double doors left wide open.
Because it allowed for a technique that is incredibly common in financial crime, which is structuring.
Also known in the industry as smurfing.
Smurfing.
Yeah, if a drug cartel needs to wash 20 million pesos, they aren't going to walk into a bank branch with 20 million in cash and trigger a report. Instead, they break that large sum down into smaller, innocuous increments. They hire 10 different people, the Smurfs.
Ah, I see.
Each Smurf takes a fraction of the cash and deposits, say, 3.9 million pesos into various accounts across different banks over a few days.
They stay mathematically underneath the 4 million peso ceiling.
Exactly. They successfully integrate the 20 million pesos into the banking system. And because no single transaction hit the threshold, the bank's automated compliance software never generates a report. The AMLC remains completely blind to the influx of dirty money.
Which leads us to the inevitable government countermove. The authorities realize they are being outmaneuvered by basic arithmetic. This brings us to the 2003 amendment of the law, Republic Act 9194. This is where the government decides to drastically tighten the screws on the banking sector.
They engineered a massive contraction of that reporting window. RA 9194 took that 4 million peso threshold and dropped it like a stone down to 500,000 pesos.
That is a huge drop.
It really is. Furthermore, they eliminated the 5-day window. The time frame was restricted to just one single banking day.
That is a staggering reduction. So suddenly any cash or non-cash transaction exceeding 500,000 pesos in a single day automatically triggers what the law calls a covered transaction report, or a CTR. The bank software flags it, a report is generated, and it is sent directly to the AMLC.
It made bulk cash smuggling into banks infinitely more difficult. But the regulators knew that simply changing the math wasn't enough. Criminals would just hire more Smurfs and make smaller deposits.
Right, just do 50 deposits of 400,000 instead.
Precisely. To truly combat the evolving threat, RA 9194 introduced a completely new conceptual tool that changed the entire philosophy of financial monitoring. The Suspicious Transaction Report, or STR.
This is where the law moves from just counting money to actually analyzing human psychology.
That is the perfect way to frame it. A covered transaction report is purely quantitative. It asks a binary proffer: is the transaction over 500,000 pesos? Yes or no? If yes, generate the report. It doesn't matter if the transaction is a legitimate real estate down payment or a drug deal. The math triggers the report.
But an STR is different.
Very different. A suspicious transaction report is qualitative. It is entirely behavioral. And the most revolutionary aspect of the STR is that there is no minimum monetary amount required to trigger it.
Wait, none at all.
Zero.
Let's test that. Let's say I walk into a bank and deposit the equivalent of $20, but I am acting incredibly erratic, refusing to show my ID, and sweating profusely. Can the teller legally file a federal intelligence report on me for a $20 deposit?
Technically and legally, yes. The law shifted the burden of observation onto the frontline bank employees. RA 9194 provides a very specific list of behavioral indicators that warrant an STR. For instance, if a client attempts a transaction, but there is no underlying legal or trade obligation or no logical economic justification for it.
Like moving money just for the sake of moving it.
Right. Or if a client deliberately refuses to be properly identified or hands over identification documents that look forged or inconsistent.
It's about looking for anomalies in the narrative, not just the numbers.
Exactly. Another major trigger is when the amount involved is completely incommensurate with the known business or financial capacity of the client. Imagine a college student whose account history shows they work a part-time minimum wage job, suddenly receiving a wire transfer for $200,000 from an offshore account in the Cayman Islands.
Okay, yeah, that looks bad.
It doesn't hit the CPR threshold if it's in dollars, but the behavior is wildly out of character for that specific profile.
And what about the Smurfs? The people trying to dodge the new 500K limit?
The STR system was designed specifically to catch them. One of the primary triggers for an STR is if an employee observes that a transaction is being structured explicitly to avoid the 500,000 peso reporting threshold.
So if I walk into the same branch and I deposit 499,000 pesos on Monday and then 499,000 on Tuesday and again on Wednesday.
You have successfully avoided triggering the automated CTR, but you have absolutely triggered a behavioral STR for structuring. Bank tellers, branch managers, and back-office compliance officers undergo rigorous training to spot exactly that kind of artificial pattern. They see the artificiality of the numbers, they file the STR, and the AMLC begins an investigation into why you were trying so hard to hide your cash flow.
It feels like a massive game of whack-a-mole. The government realized that regulating a banking system was like trying to plug holes in a heavily leaking bucket. First, you plug the commercial banks with the original law. Then the pressure builds, and the criminals find the smurfing loophole. So you plug that hole with the 500K limit and the STRs. But the water pressure, the massive volume of illicit cash that needs to be washed, doesn't just disappear. The water just shoots out somewhere else.
That bucket analogy perfectly captures the systemic risk, and that is exactly how the global illicit economy reacted. As the traditional commercial banks became strictly regulated fortresses, guarded by compliance officers filing STRs, the syndicates had to pivot. The dirty money began flowing rapidly into other sectors of the economy sectors that were entirely outside the AMLC's jurisdiction.
Which brings us to 2012 and the passage of Republic Act 10365. The bucket is leaking from a dozen new holes, so the government has to manufacture more plugs. This amendment was a massive paradigm shift because it dramatically expanded the definition of who is actually considered a covered person under the law.
Prior to 2012, if you were an AMLC investigator, your universe was mostly confined to banks, insurance providers, and securities brokers. RA 10365 expanded that net outward to include what the Financial Action Task Force, the Global Standard Setter for Anti-Money Laundering, refers to as DNFBPs.
Designated Non-Financial Businesses and Professions. It's a clunky acronym, but it represents a massive expansion of surveillance. Who specifically got drafted into the regulatory spotlight?
Well, the law roped in entirely new industries that deal in high-value assets and complex corporate structuring. It brought in jewelry dealers who trade in precious metals or precious stones, specifically targeting cash transactions in excess of 1 million pesos.
Because if the cartel can't deposit 1 million pesos in cash at the local bank without triggering an investigation, they will just take that cash, walk into a high-end jeweler, and buy 1 million pesos worth of untraceable diamonds.
Exactly. They convert the heavy, risky paper money into a tiny, highly liquid physical asset that they can carry in their pocket across international borders. The jewelry becomes the new currency.
That makes a lot of sense.
The law also targeted company service providers. These are lawyers, accountants, or specialized agencies acting as formation agents for legal persons. People who create shell corporations or who act as nominee directors or nominee shareholders for their clients.
A nominee shareholder being someone who effectively rents their name out to be put on the official corporate registry, hiding the identity of the actual criminal who owns the company.
Right. The government realized that shell companies were the ultimate washing machines for complex frauds. So they forced the people building the washing machines to start reporting suspicious clients. The expansion also included mutual funds, closed-end investment companies, foreign exchange dealers, pawn shops, and critically, remittance and money transfer companies.
It is a massive dragnet. But it wasn't just the who that got expanded. RA 10365 also massively expanded the what. The list of unlawful activities, those predicate crimes we defined earlier with the Lingad case, grew exponentially.
The evolution of the predicate crime list reflects the evolution of global criminality. It was no longer just about traditional syndicate activities like kidnapping for ransom or drug trafficking. The 2012 amendment included plunder, robbery, extortion, and localized illegal gambling operations like Jutang and Masiao. It included piracy on the high seas.
Piracy, wow. But the additions that really stand out to me are the environmental crimes. This is a very modern 21st century recognition of where illicit wealth is coming from.
It is a vital inclusion. The law added violations of the Forestry Code, the Fisheries Code, the Mining Act, and the Wildlife Resources Conservation Act. Illegal logging operations, ravaging protected forests, or unlicensed destructive mining operations generate staggering amounts of illicit cash.
And they have to put that cash somewhere.
Exactly. That cash has to enter the legitimate economy somehow to be useful to the operators. By making environmental destruction a predicate crime, the AMLC can freeze the bank accounts of the illegal lawyers, choking off their operational funding.
The law also folded in smuggling, hijacking, arson, murder, fraud under the Securities Regulation Code, and perhaps most importantly for the post-9/11 world, terrorism and the financing of terrorism.
So if we look at the landscape in 2012, the system appears incredibly robust. The net is wide, covering banks, jewelers, and remittance agencies. The threshold is low at $500K. Human behavior is being actively monitored via STRs. The list of predicate crimes covers almost every conceivable avenue of illicit wealth generation.
On paper, it looks like an impenetrable fortress. The immune system of the Philippine financial sector had been fundamentally upgraded.
But as any cybersecurity expert will tell you, a system is only as good as its ability to withstand a targeted, highly sophisticated stress test.
Which brings us to the absolute climax of our journey today. We have traced how these rules evolved, how the bucket was repeatedly plugged. Now we're going to see what happens when those exact rules are subjected to a real-world $81 million stress test.
The big one.
Yeah. This brings us to a jaw-dropping 2020 Supreme Court case involving one of the most audacious cyber heists in human history.
The Bangladesh bank heist. This event is a masterclass in how modern syndicates don't just hack computers. They hack the friction points, the timelines, and the cultural blind spots of the international financial system.
I want to walk through this step by step because the timeline detailed in the Supreme Court records for the case of Republic versus Bloomberry Resorts reads like a thriller. It starts on February 4th, 2016. Unknown hackers, highly sophisticated threat actors, managed to infiltrate the internal computer systems of the Bangladesh Bank, which is the central bank of the nation of Bangladesh.
Right.
And from there, they gain access to the Holy Grail, the Bangladesh Bank's account at the Federal Reserve Bank of New York.
The New York Fed is the undisputed fortress of global fiat currency. Central banks all over the world hold their massive sovereign dollar reserves there. Gaining access to those systems is like finding the master key to the global economy.
And once these hackers are inside, they don't hesitate. They issue 35 separate SWIFT payment instructions. Let's pause and clarify what that means, because they aren't physically moving tallets of cash. What is a SWIFT instruction?
SWIFT stands for the Society for Worldwide Interbank Financial Telecommunication. It is not a bank, and it does not hold money. It is essentially a highly secure global messaging network that banks use to communicate with each other.
Sort of like a secure email system for banks.
Think of it like a VIP bouncer at an exclusive club. If Bank A wants to send $100 million to Bank B, they send a highly encrypted SWIFT message. If the message has the right cryptographic signatures, Bank B trusts it implicitly and credits the funds. The hackers compromised the Bangladesh bank's internal terminals, allowing them to send authenticated SWIFT messages that looked exactly as if the governor of the Bangladesh bank was hitting the send button.
And the scope of what they tried to steal is staggering. Those 35 instructions totaled $951 million US. They were trying to walk away with nearly $1 billion in a single evening.
But the New York Fed's automated defense systems are formidable. They immediately detect anomalies in the volume and destination of these requests. 30 of those payment instructions are blocked outright because they lack proper beneficiary details or trigger internal risk algorithms.
So the system worked, mostly?
Mostly, yes. Another massive instruction is put on an automatic hold because of a typographical error. The hackers literally misspelled the name of a Sri Lankan nonprofit beneficiary. That single typo caused a routing bank to manually query the transaction, freezing it and saving the Bangladesh bank hundreds of millions of dollars.
A typo saved a nation's treasury. But the hackers were firing a shotgun, hoping a few pellets would hit the target. And they did. 5 of the payment instructions clear the automated checks. The New York Fed accepts the SWIFT messages as legitimate.
5 instructions clear, and $81 million goes flying out of the New York Fed, vanishing into the ether of the global banking system.
Where does it land?
It lands exactly where the hackers meticulously planned for it to land, in the Philippine commercial banking system. Specifically, the money is wired to 4 distinct bank accounts held at Rizal Commercial Banking Corporation, or RCBC, at a specific branch in Jupiter Street, Makati. The accounts are registered under the names Michael F. Cruz, Jesse Christopher M. Lagrosas, Alfred S. Vergara, and Enrico T. Vasquez.
But the destination isn't the genius part of this heist. It is the timing. The $81 million lands in those RCBC accounts on Friday, February 5th. Over the weekend, the staff at the Bangladesh bank realized their printers are broken, they reboot their systems, and the horrific reality of the missing funds sets in.
Panic ensues.
Massive panic. On Monday, February 8th, the Bangladesh bank frantically starts sending stop payment requests to RCBC, begging them to freeze the stolen funds. But what is February 8th, 2016 in the Philippines?
It is a public, non-working holiday. It is the Chinese New Year.
A holiday? You have got to be kidding.
Yes. The commercial banks are closed. The central bank is closed. The AMLC offices are empty. The regulatory machinery of an entire nation is paused for celebration. It is the perfect, unpatchable blind spot. RCBC branch management does not even see the frantic stop payment requests from Bangladesh until they open their doors for business on Tuesday, February 9th.
That is a 4-day head start for the hackers. By the time RCBC reads the message and hits the emergency brakes, how much of the $81 million is left in those accounts?
Only $68,305. The rest is gone.
Because between the moment the money landed on Friday the 5th and the bank opening on Tuesday the 9th, the hackers and their ground team in Manila were operating at lightning speed. The court records trace the exact path of the money. The funds from those 4 initial RCBC accounts were immediately withdrawn and funneled into a single, consolidated corporate account belonging to a man named William So-Go.
And from that consolidated account, the money is rapidly wired to a remittance company called Philrim.
And this is exactly where the expanded AMLA net, the 2012 expansion we just discussed, should have functioned as the final firewall. Philrim is a remittance company. They're explicitly a covered person under RA 10365. They are legally obligated to conduct customer due diligence, monitor for suspicious activity, and file STRs.
But instead of freezing an inexplicable massive influx of cash, Philrim acts as the ultimate distribution network for the stolen funds.
They don't hit the brakes at all. They hit the accelerator.
Yeah.
Philrim takes this massive sum and, acting on instructions from William So-Go, they deliver it straight into the heart of the Manila casino ecosystem.
India fast.
Yeah. According to the court documents, $21.2 million goes to Eastern Hawaii Leisure Company. $30.6 million is delivered to an individual named Wei Kongshu, and $29 million, which is roughly 1.365 billion Philippine pesos, is deposited directly into the BDO bank account of Bloomberry Resorts and Hotels, Inc.
Bloomberry Resorts is the corporate entity that operates Soleil Resort and Casino, which is a massive, sprawling, luxury integrated resort located on Manila Bay.
So I want to make sure I have the sequence of this magic trick correct. The hackers steal digital fiat currency from the New York Fed. They bounce it through local bank accounts and a remittance agency during a massive holiday weekend. And they ultimately dump almost $30 million into a luxury casino.
That is the sequence.
And the casino just absorbs it, thinking, hey, a whale just landed for Chinese New Year. Business is booming. Is that what happened? Is that the ultimate laundering mechanism?
It is an incredibly sophisticated exploitation of a massive legal loophole that existed at that precise moment in Philippine law. When the global news finally breaks on February 29th, and the Philippine government realizes that $81 million of stolen Federal Reserve money is sloshing around their local economy, the AMLC goes into full panic mode.
I can imagine.
They immediately file a petition in the Court of Appeals to issue a freeze order on Soler's BDO bank account to recover the 1.36 billion pesos.
But Soler doesn't just hand the money over. They fight back in court. And their legal defense, as meticulously detailed in the Supreme Court decision, is a fascinating look into the mechanics of casino operations. What was Soler's argument for why they shouldn't have their accounts frozen?
Soler's defense rested on a harsh, undeniable, technical truth. At the time of the heist, in February 2016, casinos were not classified as covered institutions under the Anti-Money Laundering Act. Despite the 2012 expansions that brought in jewelers and rentals companies, the powerful casino lobbying sector had successfully pushed back against being included.
So they weren't covered.
Therefore, Soler argued, they were not legally obligated to report suspicious transactions to the AMLC. They were not legally required to interrogate their high rollers about the origin of their funds.
They essentially said, we are an entertainment venue, not a financial regulator.
Exactly. They argued they were relying in good faith on the integrity of the banking system. They assumed that RCBC and Philrum, who were covered entities, had already done the due diligence and filtered out any dirty money before it reached the casino's bank account.
But the AMLC asks the obvious question. What exactly happened to the $29 million? How do you lose track of almost $30 million in a few days? And Soler explains the precise mechanism. They testified that a Chinese national named Ding Zais had previously advised them that he and his junket group were bringing in millions of dollars to play during the Chinese New Year holiday. When the money hit Soler's bank account, it was officially categorized as front money.
This is a crucial term in casino architecture. Premium VIP players or high rollers do not walk onto the bustling casino floor carrying canvas duffel bags stuffed with $30 million in cash. It's a security nightmare.
Right, that would be insane.
Instead, they wire front money directly into the casino's corporate bank account ahead of their arrival. When the VIP arrives at the private gaming room, the casino verifies the deposit and issues them non-negotiable chips in the exact equivalent amount.
Non-negotiable chips. This detail absolutely blew my mind when I read the source material. These are not the standard clay casino chips that you or I would use if we walked in to play blackjack. You cannot just take a non-negotiable chip to the cashier's cage and ask for cash, right?
Correct. They're also known as dead chips or rolling chips. They have one purpose and one purpose only. They must be used to place bets on the gaming tables. You cannot cash them out. You are forced to play them. This process is called rolling the chips. It guarantees the casino that the VIP will actually gamble the money they deposited, which generates the mathematical edge and the revenue for the house.
That makes sense for the casino.
But here is the laundering mechanism. When you place a bet with a non-negotiable chip and you win that hand, the dealer does not pay your winnings in more non-negotiable chips. The dealer pays your winnings in regular, fully cashable casino chips.
It is the ultimate washing machine. I put $30 million of stolen digital money into your bank account. You have me $30 million in non-negotiable plastic chips. I sit at a baccarat table in a private VIP room and play cards for 3 days straight. Statistically, I will lose a percentage to the house edge. Let's call it the cost of doing business, the laundering fee.
A very small price to pay.
Yeah, but the millions I win back on winning hands are paid out in pristine cashable chips. I take those to the cage, get a check from the casino, and the money is completely beautifully sanitized.
Exactly. The money has a perfectly legal, defensible origin story gambling winnings from a licensed integrated resort. And Soler testified that this is exactly what happened. By the time the news of the Bangladesh heist hit the front pages on February 29th, the Ding Group had already aggressively played through the majority of the front money. But the situation was even more chaotic than just one group gambling.
How so?
The Ding Group did not just sit at one table. They fragmented the money. They transferred millions of dollars worth of these non-negotiable chips to other junket operators operating within Soler, groups with names like Sun City, Gold Moon, and Laokal Y.
They dispersed the chips like dandelion seeds in the wind. The money vanished into the hands of hundreds of anonymous players, rolling across dozens of VIP tables across the massive casino floor.
By the time Solaire finally froze the Ding Group's internal casino accounts in early March, the damage was done. Out of the original 1.36 billion pesos, only a tiny fraction, around 100 million pesos worth of chips and cash, remained to be confiscated. The rest had been successfully washed and walked out the door.
Despite this, the AMLC managed to get the Court of Appeals to issue a freeze order on Solaire's corporate bank account to try and claw back whatever corporate assets they could. Solaire furiously appealed that freeze order, arguing it crippled their legitimate business operations. And the Court of Appeals actually agreed with Solaire and lifted the freeze.
So then AMLC takes it higher.
Yeah. The AMLC, refusing to give up, took the case all the way to the Supreme Court. How did the Supreme Court ultimately rule on this monumental clash between a victimized central bank and a casino loophole?
The 2020 Supreme Court ruling is a fascinating anticlimax that highlights a deeply foundational protection built into Philippine law. The Supreme Court did not rule on the morality of the casino's actions. Instead, they ruled that the entire issue of extending the freeze order was moot and academic.
Moot. Why?
Because under the strict rules of the AMLA, a freeze order cannot, under any circumstances, exceed 6 months.
Hold on, let me process this. The government knew with absolute mathematical certainty that this money was stolen from the Federal Reserve of New York. And they just let the casino unfreeze their accounts because a technical timer ran out. How is that justice?
It feels frustrating, but the 6-month limit is an absolute cornerstone of constitutional due process. The Supreme Court noted that a freeze order is a preventative temporary measure. It cannot be issued indefinitely because freezing a corporation's operating account indefinitely without a full trial is functionally equivalent to destroying the business. It violates the right to be presumed innocent and the right to due process.
I see the logic.
The law dictates that the government has 6 months to freeze the assets and file formal civil forfeiture charges. If they fail to finalize those charges within that window, the freeze automatically lifts. By the time the Supreme Court heard the Solaire case, 4 years had passed since the initial 30-day freeze order. The clock had long since run out. The court was legally bound to dismiss the petition.
So, because casinos were politically shielded from being covered entities in 2016, and because of the strict timelines protecting due process, a group of international hackers successfully washed tens of millions of dollars through the VIP rooms of Manila. They won.
They absolutely won.
But while they won the battle, the Solaire case blew the lid off a very specific, highly vulnerable mechanism in the global financial system. The authorities realized that the traditional banking bucket wasn't just leaking. The casino floor was an open fire hydrant. And the mechanism controlling that hydrant is the casino junket.
Which is exactly why the Philippine government, under immense international pressure, finally amended the law in 2017 to force casinos to become covered persons. But regulating a casino is completely different from regulating a bank. To understand why hackers chose this specific route and why it remains incredibly dangerous today, we have to look at our final piece of analysis: the deeply detailed January 2023 AMLC intelligence report on suspicious transactions associated with casino junkets.
This report is dense, it is heavy on data, and it is genuinely eye-opening because it strips away the glamour and looks at the raw machinery of these operations. Before we get into the billions of pesos and anomalies, we need to clearly, structurally define what a casino junket actually is. We touched on it with the Ding Group, but how does the AMLC officially describe this ecosystem?
A casino junket, which is sometimes marketed as casino-based tourism, is essentially a formal contractual arrangement between a licensed casino operator and an independent junket operator. The junket operator functions as a highly specialized, intensely networked VIP host. Their job is to seek out wealthy high rollers and premium players, almost exclusively from overseas jurisdictions, and organize comprehensive, all-inclusive gaming tours for them.
It's an end-to-end luxury concierge service.
Exactly. The junket operator handles everything. They book the private jets or international first-class flights. They secure the luxury hotel suites, arrange the personalized dining, and manage the local transportation. But crucially, their most important function is facilitating the massive cross-border movement of gaming funds to and from the casino on behalf of the players. In exchange for bringing this massive liquidity to the casino, the junket operator and the casino share the mathematical revenue generated by the VIP's gambling losses.
It sounds like an incredibly efficient business model for high-end hospitality, but the report notes that the international regulatory community has been sounding the alarm about this specific business model for a very long time.
Yes. The FATF, the Financial Action Task Force, which we mentioned earlier, as the global watchdog, explicitly flagged casino junkets as a critical systemic vulnerability as early as 2009. They pointed out a structural flaw: the inherently cross-border movement of people and massive pools of funds, combined with an industry-wide culture of intense secrecy regarding the true identities of the VIPs and the ultimate origin of their wealth, creates a perfect, frictionless vehicle for international money laundering.
And the scrutiny only intensified. The Asia-Pacific Group on Money Laundering, the APG, published a mutual evaluation report in 2019 that specifically zeroed in on the Philippine casino sector. They concluded that there were very significant risks of money laundering involving both domestic and foreign proceeds of crime moving through integrated resorts and their associated junket operators.
The APG highlighted a severe ongoing deficiency in regulatory oversight regarding what they call junket-to-player transactions. Think about the flow of money. The regulators and the banks could see the massive wire transfers moving from an offshore bank into the casino's corporate account. That part is visible.
Right, but then what happens?
But once that money is converted into non-negotiable chips and handed over to the junket operator to distribute to their players in the private VIP rooms, it disappears into a black box. The casino knows the junket operator, but they often don't know the true identities of the individual players placing the bets.
To peer into that black box, the AMLC pulled 2 massive data sets of suspicious transaction reports, STRs, specifically linked to the keyword junket filed by various financial institutions and casinos, and the sheer volume of the numbers they found is staggering.
It confirms every fear the regulators had. Dataset 1 pooled all STRs containing the keyword junket filed between September 2018 and January 2023. That dataset contained 3,308 individual STRs. The equivalent financial value of those suspicious transactions was 17.79 billion Philippine pesos.
Almost 18 billion pesos in flagged suspicious transactions just related to junket. That's massive.
And the data gets even more concentrated, revealing where the true risk lies. Dataset 2 focused exclusively on STRs, filed between 2020 and 2022 by just 4 specific high-risk integrated casino resorts operating in the Philippines. Those 4 specific casinos alone generated 4,110 STRs. The value, 17.59 billion pesos.
This statistically proves that the VIP rooms are flooded with highly questionable capital, but data points don't tell us the story of how the crimes are committed. What are these people actually doing on the floor? The AMLC report is brilliant because it breaks down 4 specific typologies of suspicious behavior they identified by reading through thousands of these STRs. Let's walk through them because this is where the abstract theory of laundering becomes the physical practice of crime.
The first typology is perhaps the most structurally damaging: the non-reporting of transactions in direct violation of the junket agreement. This occurs when a junket operator brings in a massive group of players, moves tens of millions of pesos through the VIP room, issues mountains of chips, and completely fails to file the required CTRs or STRs with the casino's compliance officers.
It's essentially willful blindness. They are operating a shadow ledger. They keep the regulatory authorities, and sometimes the casino itself, entirely in the dark about who is actually playing at the tables and whose money is backing the bets.
Exactly. It creates an undocumented zone within a highly regulated building. The second typology shifts from administrative failure to active criminal conspiracy. This involves instances where the junket operators themselves, or their primary VIP clients, are deeply publicly entangled in massive predicate crimes.
How does that play out on the floor?
The report highlights cases involving individuals orchestrating massive multi-million-dollar Ponzi schemes or investment pyramiding scams. When the authorities start closing in on their bank accounts, these scammers use the junket system as an emergency escape hatch for their illicit wealth. They wire their stolen money to the junket operator as front money. They get issued millions in non-negotiable chips. But, and here's the key behavior, they don't actually participate in any serious gaming activities.
Wait, they don't gamble?
No, they aren't there to gamble. They just sit in the VIP room, holding the value of their stolen money in the physical form of casino chips, safely outside the reach of a bank freeze order.
They are using the casino as a stateless vault, which leads perfectly into the third typology, which is a classic, aggressive money laundering maneuver designed to integrate dirty cash.
Yes. The purchase of chips with small denomination currency, followed immediately by modest, low-risk gambling actions. Imagine a scenario. An individual walks into a VIP room with several canvas duffel bags. The bags are heavy, stuffed with low-denomination, crumpled bills street cash generated from localized drug sales or illegal underground gambling rings. It is incredibly dirty money. They approach the junket cashier and use this massive volume of small currency to purchase high-value casino chips.
They've traded the duffel bags for a few stacks of plastic. What's the next step?
They walk over to a baccarat table. They sit down and play a few hands. They make modest, calculated bets, perhaps playing both sides of the table to minimize any actual mathematical loss.
Yeah.
They do this just long enough to create the credible illusion of gambling. After an hour, they stand up and cash out their remaining chips. But when they go to the main casino cage to cash out, the casino does not hand them back their duffel bags full of crumpled street cash. The casino cage issues them a corporate check, or wires the money directly to their legitimate bank account, or hands them pristine, sequential, large denomination bills.
The alchemy is complete. The street cash is instantly legitimized. When the bank compliance officer asks them next week where they got 2 million pesos, they just pull out a shiny receipt from the casino and say, hey, I had an incredibly lucky night at the VIP tables. The bank accepts the economic justification, and the money is clean.
It provides the perfect, legally defensible cover story. The fourth typology the AMLC identified is the broadest and relies heavily on the knowing your customer principle. It involves the conduct of financial transactions that are simply not commensurate with the declared source of funds of the player.
Give me an example of what that looks like on an STR.
A junket player registers with the casino. On their intake form, they declare their occupation as a mid-level manager at a local manufacturing firm with an estimated annual salary of maybe 1 million pesos. 2 weeks later, the same individual initiates a massive wire transfer of 50 million pesos into the casino's front money account, claiming it is for a weekend of baccarat.
Yeah, the math is completely broken there.
The transaction size wildly deviates from their known financial capacity, immediately flagging the transaction as highly suspicious and requiring an investigation into who is actually funding that player.
These 4 typologies explain the daily grind of casino laundering. But as I was reading through the data in this 2023 report, there is one specific anomaly that absolutely stopped me in my tracks. The AMLC noted a massive, unprecedented spike in the total value of STRs filed in the year 2022.
It was a massive statistical outlier. In 2022 alone, the aggregate financial amount of junket-related STRs spiked to a staggering 9.68 billion pesos, almost 10 billion pesos flagged in a single year. And when the AMLC dug into the data, they found that this massive sudden increase was not generated by thousands of small smurfing transactions. It was attributed to just 13 specific STRs.
13 reports accounting for nearly 10 billion pesos. What on earth were these 13 individuals doing?
They were utilizing a very specific, highly unusual transaction type that the casino internal software coded as safekeeping of playing chips with the casino treasury division. The individual STRs filed for these safekeeping transactions were valued between 100 million and 300 million pesos each.
So wait, let me get my head around the mechanics of this. They aren't laundering through baccarat. They aren't even pretending to gamble. They are taking hundreds of millions of pesos, converting that vast wealth into physical casino chips, and then literally just walking over to the casino treasury and handing the chips back saying, hey, can you keep these safe for me in your vault? They are using the casino treasury like a safety deposit box.
That is precisely the mechanism. And it highlights why the regulators view junkets as such a profound existential vulnerability to the financial system. By converting illicit cash into chips and then keeping the value of those chips stored within the casino's internal treasury system, the beneficial owners of that money completely bypass traditional commercial banking scrutiny.
It's brilliant in a dark way. They maintain high liquidity because they can walk into the casino at any hour of the day or night and demand their chips back to convert to cash. But they leave absolutely zero paper trail in the formal, regulated financial system.
The casino effectively acts as an unregulated, highly secure offshore bank operating right in the middle of Manila. And the AMLC report points out an incredibly odd, troubling detail regarding how these casinos police themselves. Remember Dataset 2, analyzing the 4 high-risk casinos. The report notes that Casino D, they keep the names of the resorts anonymous, Casino D, did not submit a single STR relating to a specific major junket operator between the years 2020 and 2022.
Why is that odd? Maybe that specific junket operator at Casino D was just running a very clean, legitimate business.
The AMLC politely describes the zero reporting as odd because 3 of Casino D's major junket operators were simultaneously actively being flagged for massive suspicious activity by the other 3 high-risk casinos operating in the exact same area.
Oh, I see.
It strains credulity that a junket operator is running massive laundering operations at Casino A, B, and C, but is a perfect angel when they walk through the doors of Casino D. It strongly suggests a severe systemic failure of internal compliance at Casino D, or much worse, active institutional complicity in shielding their most profitable junket partners from regulatory oversight.
So if casinos and their embedded junket operators are functionally operating as this massive multi-billion peso shadow banking system, how on earth is the government fighting back today? The 2016 hackers proved the casino loophole existed and exploited it. The 2023 AMLC report proves that the junkets are still actively moving billions in highly suspicious funds. We have to look at the shield the authorities are trying to build right now to stop the bleeding.
The regulators realized that simply expanding the legal list of covered persons in 2012 to include jewelers and eventually casinos wasn't enough. If those covered persons didn't actually know how to investigate their clients, the law was useless. So in 2018, the AMLC issued a highly detailed, comprehensive set of operating regulations, the AMLCFT guidelines for designated non-financial businesses and professions.
The DNFBPs. This document is essentially a dense, step-by-step instruction manual for casino managers, jewelry dealers, and corporate lawyers on how not to accidentally facilitate a felony for a cartel.
Exactly. And the absolute cornerstone of these 2018 guidelines is a protocol known as customer due diligence, or CDD. The law strictly mandates that covered persons must establish, verify, and permanently record the true and full identity of their customers. This verification must be based on reliable, independent source documents. The era of anonymous accounts, fictitious names, and VIP guest number 4 is legally over.
But the guidelines go much further than just asking a customer to hand over a driver's license and making a photocopy. They mandate what the AMLC calls a risk-based approach. What does that mean in practice?
It acknowledges that not all customers pose the same threat to the financial system. The compliance response must scale with the risk. If a local public school teacher walks into a jewelry store and buys a small gold necklace for their anniversary, the money laundering risk is virtually zero. That transaction requires normal, standard customer due diligence. Check the ID, log the receipt. But if the circumstances of the transaction hit certain established red flags, the institution is legally required to escalate their investigation and trigger enhanced due diligence, or EDD.
What specific scenarios trigger this enhanced due diligence? When does the compliance officer have to start interrogating the client?
Several high-risk scenarios trigger EDD. For example, if the customer originates from, or the funds are being wired from, a high-risk jurisdiction, a country flagged by the FATF for having inadequate money laundering standards or severe systemic corruption. Another trigger is if the customer is attempting a massive transaction without any clear, logical economic justification. Or, as we discussed with the junket typologies, if the transaction size deviates wildly from the customer's known documented financial capacity. But perhaps the most critical trigger for EDD is if the customer is identified as a PE.
A P, a politically exposed person. Let's define this clearly because this is where corruption and money laundering intersect.
A politically exposed person is an individual who is or has been entrusted with prominent public functions. We're talking about heads of state, senior politicians, high-ranking military officers, senior executives of state-owned corporations, or prominent political party officials. Because of their elevated position, these individuals have direct access to public funds, control over massive government contracts, and are therefore at a statistically much higher risk for committing bribery and corruption.
So if a PP walks into a casino or a bank to open an account, the red lights start flashing. What does enhanced due diligence actually require the institution to do?
It requires a deep dive into the individual's life. The institution must obtain additional verifying information. Where exactly does their total wealth come from? What is the specific documented source of the exact funds being deposited today? They cannot just take the politician's word for it. They need documentation. Furthermore, the definition of a PA extends outward. The institution must also identify and apply EDD to the immediate family members and publicly known close associates of the PA, because corrupt officials rarely put stolen money in their own bank accounts.
Right, they hide it with their family.
Exactly. And finally, opening an account for any high-risk customer or PEP requires direct written approval from senior management, ensuring that the risk is accepted at the highest corporate level.
But criminals know these rules exist. So what if the corrupt politician doesn't open the account in their own name? What if they hire a lawyer to create a shell company in the British Virgin Islands, and that shell company is owned by a trust fund registered in Panama, and the trust fund uses the politician's cousin's name on the paperwork? How does the law penetrate that kind of corporate armor?
This is where the 2018 guidelines attack the very core mechanism of modern money laundering. They legally require financial institutions and casinos to peel back the layers of the onion and identify the beneficial owner.
The beneficial owner. This is the actual human being sitting in the dark, pulling the strings behind the corporate curtain.
Exactly. The guidelines explicitly define the beneficial owner as the natural person, a living, breathing human being who ultimately owns or controls a customer or the person on whose behalf a transaction is actually being conducted. It also broadly includes those who exercise ultimate effective control over a legal arrangement, like a complex corporation or a blind trust.
So if Global Holdings LLC tries to open a VIP account at Solaire and wire in 50 million pesos, the casino compliance officer cannot just write down Global Holdings LLC on the intake form and call it a day.
Absolutely not. They are legally required to demand the corporate charter, dig through the layered corporate structure, and find the actual human beings who own the majority shares and control the money flow. If the client refuses to provide the identity of the beneficial owner, the casino is legally obligated to refuse the transaction and file a suspicious transaction report.
And once the institution successfully identifies these beneficial owners, they have to meticulously keep the receipts. The record-keeping requirements outlined in the guidelines are incredibly strict.
Very strict, because investigations often happen years after the fact. All records of customer identification, the IDs, the corporate charters, the EDD reports, as well as all transaction documents, must be maintained and safely stored for a minimum of 5 years from the date of the transaction, or for 5 years after the account is permanently closed.
And if there is an active money laundering investigation or a court case involving those specific accounts,
then the 5-year rule is suspended. Those records must be kept safely preserved indefinitely until the court case is finally and officially resolved. This ensures that when the AMLC investigators eventually come knocking, the documentary audit trail still exists.
let's talk about the reporting timelines, because the Bangladesh bank heist showed us how utterly critical time is. When the New York Fed was hacked, a 3-day holiday weekend provided the perfect blind spot that allowed $81 million to vanish into the casino ecosystem. How fast do these institutions actually have to report suspicious activity today to prevent that from happening again?
The regulatory timelines have been pulled incredibly tight. Covered persons must report all covered transactions and suspicious transactions to the AMLC within 5 working days from the occurrence thereof.
5 days. But how does the law define the occurrence of a suspicious transaction? A cash deposit is instantaneous, but sometimes it takes a compliance officer a few days of digging to realize that a complex series of wire transfers is actually highly sketchy.
The law acknowledges that reality. The guidelines specify that for a suspicious transaction, the occurrence is defined as the exact date of the determination of the suspicious nature of the transaction. But they don't have forever to make that determination. The institution is legally required to conclude their investigation and make that determination within 10 calendar days from the date the transaction actually took place.
So the clock starts ticking the moment the money moves. You have a maximum of 10 days to figure out if it's suspicious, and once you decide it is, you have exactly 5 days to transmit the STR to the government.
Exactly. However, the regulators recognize that high-level laundering schemes like international corporate trusts, moving fragmented money through dozens of shell companies, take immense time to unravel. If the situation is highly complex, the covered person is granted a reasonable extension period, not exceeding 60 calendar days, to gather the necessary facts in order to submit a meaningful, actionable STR.
If we connect all of these guidelines to the bigger picture, being a bank teller or a jewelry store manager or a casino compliance officer suddenly sounds like an incredibly stressful, high-stakes job. If you miss a structured smurfing transaction, the government could accuse you of facilitating a federal crime. But if you do catch it and you file an STR against a violent drug cartel or a powerful, corrupt politician, aren't you terrified that the criminal syndicate is going to find out and come after you or your family?
That is a very real, very visceral concern for frontline financial workers. And the law actively addresses it through 2 critical interwoven mechanisms: safe harbor and tipping off.
Let's start with the protection. Explain safe harbor.
Safe harbor is designed to protect the whistleblower from retaliation. The law explicitly states that no administrative, criminal, or civil proceedings shall lie against any person for making a covered or suspicious transaction report in the regular performance of their duties and in good faith.
So, if a jewelry dealer files an STR against a shady buyer purchasing 10 million pesos in diamonds, and the AMLC investigates and freezes the buyer's assets, the buyer cannot turn around and successfully sue the jewelry dealer for breach of privacy or defamation or loss of business.
Correct. The reporter is legally shielded from civil liability. The government absorbs the legal risk of the investigation.
But a civil lawsuit is one thing. Physical retaliation from a cartel is another. That safe harbor protection only works in the real world if the criminal syndicate doesn't actually know who filed the report against them.
Which is precisely why the prohibition against tipping off is enforced with such severe penalties. When a covered person reports a transaction to the AMLC, they, along with all their corporate officers, compliance staff, and frontline employees, are strictly legally prohibited from communicating to anyone that a report has been filed.
So you cannot call the client and say, hey, just a heads up, the government is looking into that wire transfer.
Absolutely not. You cannot warn the target. You cannot discuss it with other banks. You cannot publish the fact in a newspaper or mention it to the media. The STR must remain a completely secure, secret communication between the institution and the AMLC. Violating the tipping off provision is considered a severe criminal offense. If an employee tips off a launderer, that employee faces a penalty of 3 to 8 years in state prison and massive financial fines.
So the entire integrity of the AMLA system relies on this silent, invisible, highly protected flow of financial intelligence from the private sector directly to the government regulators. But as I was reading through the final sections of the rules, there was one specific exemption that caught my eye, and it deals with professional secrecy. What about lawyers and accountants? If a client sits down behind closed doors in a lawyer's office and confesses that they are actively laundering millions of pesos through a complex real estate scam, does the lawyer have to immediately file an STR and break attorney-client privilege?
This specific scenario was a point of massive, heated debate when RA 10365 was being drafted in the legislature. The legal and accounting professions pushed back incredibly hard against being included as covered persons, citing the ancient fundamental necessity of professional secrecy and the right to counsel. The resulting law provided a very specific, carefully worded exemption. Lawyers and accountants who are authorized to practice in the Philippines and are acting strictly as independent legal or accounting professionals are not deemed covered persons in relation to information concerning their clients, if disclosing that information would compromise client confidences or violate the attorney-client relationship.
So they are legally exempt. They do not have to report the confession.
They are exempt from the mandatory reporting of their client's secrets, yes. However, the 2018 guidelines clarify the absolute limit of this exemption. If a lawyer or an accountant is not acting purely as an independent legal advisor representing a client in court, but is instead acting as a company service provider, meaning they are the ones actually managing the client's bank accounts, actively creating the offshore shell companies, or buying and selling the business entities on the client's behalf, then the shield of privilege vanishes. In that capacity, they're operating as a covered person, and they must conduct due diligence and file STRs.
It is a brilliant distinction. You are legally allowed to keep a criminal client secret, but you cannot actively manage their dirty money for them.
Exactly. You can defend them in court, but you cannot be their launderer.
So what does this all mean? We have covered an immense, staggering amount of ground today. We started 2 decades ago with Girly J. Lingad, a rogue internal banker manipulating computer terminals. We saw how her case proved that the money itself carries the legal contagion of the crime it came from, regardless of whether the thief is convicted.
And then we watched as the Philippine government realized the banking bucket was leaking, leading them to lower the reporting thresholds, invent the behavioral STR to catch smurfing, and cast a much wider net that captured jewelry stores and remittance companies.
But then we saw that expanded net utterly fail during the 2016 Bangladesh bank heist. We watched hackers expertly exploit a cultural holiday weekend and a glaring legal loophole that allowed Manila casinos to act as unregulated washing machines, converting $81 million of stolen New York Fed money into untraceable, non-negotiable plastic chips.
And we looked at the startling data in the 2023 AMLC intelligence report, which proved that even today, the casino junket system remains a multi-billion peso black hole. We explored how high rollers and criminal syndicates use casino treasuries as secret, stateless bank vaults for safekeeping billions in chips, completely bypassing the formal banking sector.
Finally, we examine the modern shield, the strict, exhaustive rules of customer due diligence, the unmasking of beneficial owners, and the delicate, high-stakes balance of safe harbor and tipping off.
It is a breathtakingly complex, constantly shifting ecosystem, and it requires immense, constant vigilance from both the regulators and the private sector to maintain its integrity.
And why should you, the listener, care about any of this? Why does this dense alphabet soup of AMLA, STRs, DNF, BPs, and PPs matter to your everyday life? Because it is vital to remember that money laundering is not a victimless white-collar crime. Laundering is the oxygen for the predicate crimes. Without the ability to wash the money and use it in the legitimate economy, kidnapping for ransom becomes unprofitable. Drug trafficking cartels choke on the sheer physical volume of their own useless cash. Illegal ligging and environmental destruction lose their financial incentive.
The friction you experience in your everyday life, when you're standing at your local bank teller's window and you have to show two forms of ID and explain the source of a large cash deposit, that minor inconvenience is the direct intended fallout from this invisible global war. It is the necessary price of keeping the financial system intact and defunding the syndicates.
But as we close this deep dive, there is a final, highly provocative question we have to consider. The AMLC report and the audacious Bangladesh heist showed us the profound vulnerabilities of physical casino junkets, private VIP rooms, and plastic rolling chips. But the world is not standing still. As technology advances exponentially into the realm of decentralized finance, complex cryptocurrency mixers, and fully immersive virtual metaverses, we have to ask a difficult question. Will the next casino junket even exist in the physical world?
That is a terrifying thought. You don't need a VIP room in Manila if you have a VR headset.
Exactly. Will the next $81 million vanish into a completely digital, unregulated casino operating on a decentralized server spread across 10 different countries? A space where the non-negotiable chips are untraceable lines of cryptographic code and the VIP players are entirely anonymous digital avatars.
The authorities spent 20 years building a massive legal wall, and the criminals built a tunnel. But what happens when the criminals no longer need the physical ground to dig through? The law and our understanding of financial reality will be forced to evolve all over again.
A completely invisible, decentralized casino, that is a chilling thought to leave you with. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Keep questioning the systems around you, and we will see you next time.
Welcome to the debate. You know, when hydrologists want to map out a really complex underground river system, they use a dye test.
Right. They just pour a vibrant fluorescent dye into the water at the source.
Exactly. They pour it in, and then they just watch. If the plumbing of the Earth is straightforward, that bright color simply flows from point A to point B, perfectly visible.
Yeah, it traces the exact path of the current. I mean, it's an elegant solution. Gives you a perfect map of the hydrology.
It does, but, well, sometimes that dye hits a massive, completely submerged cavern. The water slows down, it pools, it mixes with like a dozen other hidden tributaries, and suddenly the water emerging on the other side is completely clear. The dye just vanished.
Which is a pretty fitting analogy for what we're talking about today.
I think so. Because when we look at international finance, and specifically the movement of illicit funds, forensic accountants and regulators are basically constantly running dye tests. And for years, one of the most notorious underground caverns in the global financial system has been the casino junket industry.
Absolutely. I mean, it's an industry explicitly designed to cater to high net worth individuals. It offers them, extreme anonymity, moving their money across borders, often totally outside of traditional banking channels.
Right, by converting their fiat currency into casino chips.
Exactly. It is in a lot of ways the absolute definition of a regulatory black hole.
Which brings us perfectly to the core of our discussion today. We are untangling the effectiveness and the structural integrity of the Philippine Anti-Money Laundering Framework, or the AML framework.
Right. We're looking squarely at how this legal architecture handles these incredibly complex, high-volume financial networks like those casino junkets.
The central question we are exploring here is whether the evolving Philippine AML framework is a robust, adaptable system capable of tracking and prosecuting sophisticated illicit fund flows. Or, on the flip side, if it's ultimately compromised by statutory limitations and operational loopholes that, sophisticated actors can just easily exploit.
And this should ground our listeners really quickly. Our analysis today is built entirely on the statutory texts of the Republic Acts, recent Philippine Supreme Court rulings, and the granular data from the January 2023 Anti-Money Laundering Council report, the AMLC report specifically on casino junkets.
Right. So I am going to argue that the Philippine AML framework is actually doing an incredible job acting as that die test. It's a highly effective, continuously adapting net that successfully utilizes raw data and sharp legal precedent to capture illicit activity.
And I am taking the stance that while the net is certainly catching some fish, this framework has fatal structural blind spots, from statutory time limits on asset freezing to the fundamental opacity of casino chips themselves. These blind spots render the system practically inadequate against truly sophisticated money laundering.
Well, I think the best place to start is by looking at how this framework isn't just some static wall, right? It's a living, breathing, regulatory organism. And we can see this evolution incredibly clearly in the legal precedents.
You're talking about the recent Supreme Court rulings, right?
Exactly. Take the Lingad Supreme Court precedent from October 2022. This was a massive, truly structural victory for the entire regulatory system. In this ruling, the Supreme Court affirmed that a money laundering offense can be prosecuted entirely independently of the unlawful activity, or, what we call the predicate crime.
Right, the predicate crime being the initial illegal act that actually generated the dirty money in the first place, like a bank heist or drug trafficking or corporate fraud.
Precisely. Before precedents like this, investigators were often totally hamstrung. They had to wait for, say, a foreign court to successfully convict a hacker or a cartel boss before they could legally prove the money sitting in a Manila bank account was laundered.
Which could take years, honestly.
Decades, sometimes. But under Section 4 of the Anti-Money Laundering Act, the state only has to prove that the money launderer transacted the proceeds knowing they came from an unlawful activity.
So they don't need the original conviction anymore?
Right. By decoupling the money laundering charge from the predicate crime, the burden of proof is shifted completely favorably for regulators. It drastically streamlines prosecutions. And beyond just the legal architecture, the sheer volume of data being captured proves the functionality of the system on the ground.
Well, data collection is one thing, but
let me just give you the numbers, because they're staggering. The 2023 AMLC report shows 3,308 suspicious transaction reports, or STRs, specifically related to junkets. That data set captured 17.79 billion Philippine pesos in potential illicit flows.
Okay, that is a big number, I'll grant you that.
It is. The reporting mechanisms are actively working, specifically through indicators like SI1. Think of SI1 as the makes no sense alarm. If a 20-year-old student with zero listed corporate income suddenly wires 3 million pesos to a high-roller VIP casino account, the SI1 alarm goes off because there's absolutely no economic justification for that cash.
I come at it from a different way, though, because collecting massive amounts of data is not the same thing as actually preventing a crime. And capturing billions of pesos in a regulatory spreadsheet does not mean you have actually disrupted the laundering process.
But it's the first step, isn't it? Visibility.
Visibility doesn't mean action. The Philippine AML system is plagued by exploitable operational realities that these sophisticated syndicates understand perfectly. My primary exhibit here is the Supreme Court case of Republic via Bloomberry Resorts, which is universally known as the Solaire case.
Right, the Bangladesh bank hack.
Exactly. Early 2016, hackers breached the Bangladesh bank's account at the New York Federal Reserve and stole $81 million. Now, the AML framework actually did its job initially, to your point. It managed to track $29 million of that stolen money through the Philippine banking system via a remittance company directly into a Solaire casino bank account.
So the system saw the dye in the water, just like I was saying.
It saw the dye, but the moment that money was converted into non-negotiable chips for a junket operator known as the Ding Group, the money effectively vanished. It was a complete dead end.
That's a specific mechanical issue with the chips, though.
But it gets worse, because even when the government manages to track these funds, they are paralyzed by a statutory ticking clock. Under Republic Act 10365, there is a strict 6-month statutory maximum on freeze orders.
Well, we have to talk about why that exists. But go ahead.
Criminals don't necessarily have to win in court. They simply have to outweight the bureaucracy. It renders all that brilliant data collection you mentioned entirely useless because the actual recovery of funds is legally blocked after 6 months.
But let's look closer at that data collection, because I think it tells a story of a system that is actively learning where its blind spots are. When we look at the 2023 AMLC report, Dataset 2 provides a highly specific analysis of 4,110 suspicious transaction reports, and these were filed by 4 higher-risk integrated resorts.
Right, the big casinos.
Yes. And out of that pool, 703 STRs directly involved junket operators, capturing a staggering 9.60 billion pesos in suspicious flows. What this tells us is that the anti-money laundering and countering the financing of terrorism controls are working exactly as intended right on the casino floor. Are they, though?
They are. They're identifying the highest risk behavior. For example, the report highlights the safekeeping of playing chips. In 2022 alone, there were 13 STRs filed regarding individuals parking massive amounts of chips with the Casino Treasury Division without actually placing a single bet.
Just treating it like a bank.
Exactly. These were valued between 100 million and 300 million pesos each. That is the system successfully flagging a textbook money laundering typology, using the casino cage as an unregulated anonymous bank vault.
I'm sorry, but I just don't buy that. Let me tell you why. You are pointing to the successes within Dataset 2, but you are completely ignoring the glaring operational failure detailed in that exact same dataset.
You mean Casino D? Yes, Casino D. The report analyzed 4 high-risk integrated resorts. Over a 2-year period, Casino D filed absolutely 0 STRs relating to specific junket operators. 0.
Well, yes, it was an anomaly.
This is despite the fact that 3 of its junket operators were actively flagged for highly suspicious activity by the other high-risk resorts in the exact same geographic area. And this is the real takeaway for the listener here. Casino D didn't have broken computers or lazy compliance officers. They had a broken incentive structure.
Because of the VIP revenue.
Exactly. When a single VIP gambler brought in by a junket can generate millions of dollars in revenue over a weekend, a casino is financially incentivized to just wear a blindfold. The entire AML framework relies heavily on voluntary compliance from these entities. If one node in the network simply ignores the rules to keep the high rollers happy, the entire network is compromised.
I see why you think that, but let me give you a different perspective. Think of the reporting system like an air traffic control radar. Just because one transponder is intentionally turned off, in this case Casino D, doesn't mean the radar itself is fundamentally broken.
But the plane is flying blind.
But we know the plane is there. It actually highlights exactly where enforcement needs to be surgically directed. The AMLC report explicitly flags Casino D's non-reporting as an anomaly. Doesn't the fact that we know Casino D is an outlier prove that the overarching oversight is working?
I mean, finding a hole in the roof doesn't mean the roof is working. It means it's leaking.
But the regulator can now target Casino D with deep dive compliance checks, audits, and potentially massive administrative sanctions. The data is functioning as a diagnostic tool to enforce sector-wide compliance.
But a diagnostic tool only works if you have time to act before the plane disappears off the radar entirely. And in the world of casino junkets, that disappearance happens the second fiat currency hits the felt.
Okay, explain what you mean by that.
I want to spend a moment explaining exactly why junket operators exist and the mechanics of how money is actually laundered through them, because it demonstrates why STRs alone are utterly insufficient. Junkets primarily exist to facilitate high rollers, often bypassing strict capital flight laws in jurisdictions like mainland China, to get their wealth into places like Manila.
Right, bringing in players who couldn't otherwise move their cash.
Exactly. Let's look at how the Ding Group operated in the Soler case. They didn't just walk into the lobby with duffel bags of cash. The $29 million in illicit hacked funds was wired into the casino's bank account as front money.
Through the Philarem remittance company.
Yes. And that front money was then exchanged for non-negotiable chips. At this exact moment, the AML framework loses its visibility.
Walk us through that specific conversion process. How does a non-negotiable chip actually wash the money?
Because here is the genius of the dead chip mechanic. A non-negotiable chip, or a dead chip, can only be used to place bets on the tables. it cannot be taken to the cage and immediately cashed out for fiat currency. You have to play it.
You have to risk it.
Right. When you bet a dead chip and you win a hand of baccarat, the casino pays your winnings in standard, negotiable cash chips. This forces the premium player to roll their money through the casino ecosystem. You take those newly won cash chips to the cage, and the casino writes you a check.
And now it looks like clean casino winnings.
Suddenly, you don't have stolen Bangladesh bank funds. You have legitimate casino winnings backed by a clean receipt. The money has been perfectly washed. But the obfuscation goes even deeper here. The Dean Group took their initial non-negotiable chips and distributed them like a shadow currency.
They broke it up.
Yes. They transferred 903 million pesos worth of chips to a fixed-room junket operator called Sun City. They transferred another 100 million to Gold Moon and 31 million to a casual operator named Lao Ka Wai. Once fiat currency becomes a chip, and that chip is handed off to an intermediary junket operator inside the VIP rooms, the paper trail simply evaporates. It's the die hitting the underground cavern.
That's an interesting point, though I would frame it differently. You are using the mechanics of the Solaire incident as proof of a current, ongoing systemic failure. But the timeline is absolutely crucial here.
How so?
The Solaire incident occurred in early 2016. At that specific time, casinos were not covered institutions under the Anti-Money Laundering Act. They were legally outside the reporting net entirely.
Well, sure, they weren't covered yet, but the mechanic is the same.
But the system recognized the cavern, and it adapted. We saw the subsequent passage of Republic Act 1090-27, and later the specific regulatory issuances for designated non-financial businesses and professions, or DNFBPs.
Right. Bringing casinos under the purview of the AMLC.
Exactly. And those DNFBP guidelines specifically mandate strict customer due diligence, or CDD. It requires risk-based screening and, crucially, face-to-face contact verification for high-risk clients before a business relationship is established.
So the casino has to know exactly who is playing.
Right. Section 23 of the DNFBP guidelines specifically states that institutions must determine the true nature of a beneficial owner, trustee, nominee, or agent. It forces the casino to look past the junket operator, past Sun City or Lao Ka Wai, and identify the actual flesh and blood individual playing the chips.
On paper, yes.
The vulnerability you're describing from 2016 was directly addressed by expanding the definition of covered persons to include the casinos themselves, forcing them to trace that shadow currency.
That's a compelling argument, but have you considered the statutory brick wall that still paralyzes the state? Even when they do everything right?
You're talking about the freeze limits?
Yes. Even if the casino does its customer due diligence, and even if they successfully file the suspicious transaction report to the AMLC, what happens when the government actually tries to seize the money? Let's look at the Supreme Court's ruling in that same Bloomberry case.
Which was a very specific procedural outcome.
But a very telling one. The AMLC successfully petitioned the Court of Appeals for a freeze order on the Solaire bank account. But Republic Act 10365 places a strict, inflexible 6-month statutory maximum on freeze orders. When the AMLC went to the Supreme Court to try and extend it, the court declared the petition moot. Why? Because the 6 months had elapsed. The court explicitly ruled that a freeze order cannot be issued indefinitely.
Now, if you're listening to this, you're probably screaming at your phone right now, 6 months to investigate international hackers. That sounds absurdly short, but we have to look at why that limit exists.
I'm all ears.
I'm not convinced by that line of reasoning, because you are characterizing the 6-month ticking clock as a loophole, when it is actually a vital, non-negotiable constitutional safeguard. We are talking about the state's power to completely freeze a legitimate business's operating capital without a full trial.
But in the case of a massive money laundering operation?
Imagine running a massive integrated resort with 5,000 employees, and the government freezes your operating accounts for 3 years, based merely on probable cause. It would violate fundamental due process and completely destroy innocent businesses. The Supreme Court in the Bloomberry case was very clear on this protection.
I understand the constitutional argument, I do, and I agree due process is paramount. But the operational reality is that investigating an international cyber heist involving hackers, foreign central banks, remittance companies, and underground casino junkets takes years, not months.
It's complex, sure, but
Getting authenticated financial documents from a jurisdiction like Bangladesh via diplomatic channels alone can take 4 months. By imposing a strict 6-month limit, the timeline is mathematically rigged against the state.
I wouldn't say rigged.
The criminals don't have to win their case in court. They just have to run out the clock. Once that 6-month freeze order lifts, that money is wired out of the Philippine jurisdiction in seconds. It is a massive structural advantage given directly to the money launderers.
But let's follow the legal architecture to its logical end here. The 6-month freeze order under Section 10 of the AMLA is only meant to be a temporary bridge. It's a holding pattern intended to give the state enough time to file a formal civil forfeiture petition under Section 12.
Which is a whole separate process.
Exactly. Think of Section 12 as the civil forfeiture trigger. If the state has the evidence, 6 months is a reasonable amount of time to simply initiate civil forfeiture proceedings against the assets. You don't have to finish the trial in 6 months. You just have to formally file it.
But practically speaking,
The law is carefully balanced. It gives regulators a powerful, immediate tool to stop the bleeding, the freeze order, but sets a strict deadline to ensure they actually do the rigorous legal work to prove their case. It prevents state overreach. If the AMLC fails to pull the civil forfeiture trigger within 6 months, that is a procedural reality of the investigation, not a systemic flaw in the framework's design.
but you are missing the physical reality of the casino floor. Civil forfeiture allows the state to seize property that is related to an unlawful activity. But how do you seize a non-negotiable chip that has already been played, lost, or transferred to an anonymous premium player who flew back to Macau 3 months ago?
Well, they track the accounts.
The Solar case proved that out of the $29 million deposited into the casino, the accounts were frozen when the news broke, but all that remained was just over 100 million pesos, a tiny, tiny fraction of the total.
Right, most of it had been played.
Exactly. The rest had already been cycled through the baccarat tables and converted to legitimate winnings or mathematically absorbed by the house edge. A civil forfeiture action is meaningless if the asset has fundamentally changed form and vanished. By the time the government is ready to file that civil forfeiture after 6 months, there is literally nothing left to forfeit.
But again, this goes back to my point about the continuous evolution of the framework. Because casinos are now covered entities, they are legally required to maintain an audit trail for exactly those transactions.
Assuming they comply.
The DNFBP guidelines require them to keep detailed records for 5 years. They must maintain a system that understands the normal account activity of their clients and files STRs when the amount involved is not commensurate with the client's financial capacity.
The physical opacity of the casino chip is actively countered by the legally mandated transparency of the player's profile.
A mandated transparency that, as Dataset 2 proved with Casino D, is completely dependent on the casino actually choosing to comply, at the risk of alienating their most lucrative million-dollar clientele.
Well, as we step back to look at the larger picture here, my stance remains that the Philippine anti-money laundering framework is a highly resilient, constantly adapting legal architecture.
We've definitely seen some adaptation. Right. We have seen the deliberate expansion of the law to cover casinos and non-financial businesses, directly closing the very loopholes exploited in 2016. We have the Lingad Supreme Court precedent, which definitively streamlines prosecutions by detaching the money laundering offense from the original predicate crime. And we have the massive, undeniable data yields from suspicious transaction reports that prove the system is actively monitoring, flagging, and investigating billions of pesos in illicit flows.
And my contrasting stance is that while the text of the law is indeed expanding to look good on paper, the operational reality tells a vastly different story.
The operational realities are always going to be tough.
But they're fundamentally limiting here. The economic incentives for casinos to ignore compliance, the brilliant mechanics of washing fiat currency through dead chips, and the strict 6-month statutory limits on freeze orders continue to provide a highly effective safe harbor for sophisticated syndicates. A net with a few large, well-documented holes is still a broken net.
I think where we absolutely converge today is on the sheer, breathtaking scale of the issue. The volume of suspicious money flowing through the system, we are talking about tens of billions of pesos annually, is staggering. The stakes for the integrity of the international financial system are incredibly high.
Completely agreed. The data in the AMLC report is a very sobering reminder of the scale of global illicit finance. Where we fundamentally remain in disagreement is whether the current legal tools, like the 6-month ticking clock on freeze orders, are inherently flawed because they give criminals an escape hatch, or if those limits are simply necessary boundaries to protect a functioning economy from state overreach.
Exactly. Examining both the high-level legal precedents like the Bloomberg and Lingad rulings, alongside the ground-level operational mechanics of how a casino junket actually washes money, well, it offers immense value to anyone trying to understand this space.
You really have to look at both the law and the floor.
It is the only way to truly grasp the complexity of international finance and the regulatory challenge of policing it. The evolving nature of global laundering means there is always more to explore on how these regulations are enforced in reality. Because ultimately, no matter how sophisticated our regulatory dye test becomes, the underground river is always carving new caverns.
We just have to decide if we're content knowing the water is polluted or if we're actually going to map the cave.